Hi folks, today I'm going to show you how to make these gorgeous contrasting cuffs for your tunic or dress. Now this method is used during construction, so it's not for putting cuffs on a garment that's already made. So if that's actually what you're looking for, hold fast. I'll pop a link up there to the video for that technique when it's finished. But for now, we're going to talk about how to put cuffs in as you make your sleeves. This technique works really well on both wool and linen. It looks a little bit tricky at first, but don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it step by step. If you've got any questions, as always, pop them in the comments or come and find me on Facebook. Let's get started. So, for this project, you're going to need your sleeves ready cut, your chosen fabric for your contrasting cuff pieces, some matching thread for your contrasting pieces, the thread that you're going to use for your sleeves to match your main body piece colours, a needle, some pins, your trusty scissors, a pencil and a ruler. Okay everyone, before we start I want to show you a little trick I use when I'm cutting out my sleeves. You can see the sleeve here is folded in half. What you'll notice is just here I've cut the start of the sleeve straight and then sloped it from there. Now the reason I've done this is because on this sleeve I'd already decided that I wanted my cuff piece to be 2 inches wide. So when I'm cutting out my sleeve, before I start the slope to the shoulder, I come in straight 2 inches, and that makes it an awful lot easier when you get to the point of attaching the cuff, because you don't have to worry about diagonals. If you've made tunics before, you may have encountered the problem of when you've got to the end here and you're turning back. If I fold this one back just to there to show you, when you're turning back your hem, I've rolled it up nicely, but it's just a little bit shorter here than the bit of the sleeve you're turning into, which can make it tricky to get it sat nice. It's easier with very small hems, but if you're still learning and you're using slightly wider hems, then you might encounter this problem. And just cutting that first bit straight solves it. When I'm doing a rolled hem or a very fine turned hem, I'll usually make my hems about 1/4 of an inch, just there. Which means that when I'm cutting, I come back in 1/4, another 1/4, because you're going to roll it to enclose the raw edge. And then I come back between 1/4 and a full 1/2 inch again, just to make sure that what I'm rolling that back onto is exactly the same width, and that solves that problem. Now, the end of our sleeve piece here is 12 inches wide. To get the width for the piece you're going to need to cut for your contrasting piece, you need it to be at least the same width, and ideally I should have done this a little bit wider. That just gives you a little bit more room to play with when you're sewing it all up. So that's your width measurement. Now I'm going to show you the height measurement, because that's where things get a little bit more complicated. You can see that's 2 inches there. It's our contrasting piece. We're only going to be using 2 inches of this. What's all this excess for? The first one is because we're going to sew from the inside and we're going to leave a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top. That's going to be all on the inside when it's flipped over. We also need room at the bottom for turning our hem. Now, if you're a bit more experienced, you might want to only leave 1/2 inch here and just do extremely tiny seams. However, if you're just starting, leave yourself 1 inch, because that gives you plenty of room to get used to manipulating the fabric. So for this example, our facing piece is going to be 12 inches wide and 3.5 inches deep. That's your 2 inches for your facing, your 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top, and your inch seam allowance at the bottom. Now to get this in exactly the right place, we're going to do some marking. This is where, once again, I absolutely love this cutting mat. However, if you haven't got one, you can just mark your points on with a pencil. Just make sure that you very accurately cut out your piece to begin with. You can see here I've just made it a little bit wider there. We're going to ignore that because we can fix that with the measurements and when we sew it on. But if you haven't got a cutting mat, that would be a problem. So you need to make sure everything lines up nicely. Now, we need to mark a sewing line along the top of this piece. If you get your line lined up exactly at the bottom, what you're going to do is you're going to come up 1 inch for your hem at the bottom, 2 inches for the visible piece of the cuff, and then you're going to mark 1/2 inch seam allowance all along the top here. This is the line that you're going to be sewing along when you attach your cuff piece to your main sleeve piece. So that is our first sewing line. You can use whatever you like to mark it. I use a pencil because I'm a heathen. However, you can use whatever you like. Just make sure that whatever you're using isn't going to show through on the right side, especially if you're doing this with very pale fabric. Now, to make this easier to manipulate when you've sewn it on, you're not going to sew all the way along. First of all, we're going to come in and mark our sew line. I'm using 1/2 inch because that's what I use for all my seam allowances, because once it's tucked under, it makes a seam always under 6mm, which is the rule that I try to follow with my historical sewing. Now, you think, great, we're going to sew up to this line, but wait, we're not, and I'll show you why later on. Just mark about 1/4 inch in each side. It may seem mysterious at the moment, but all will become clear. So we've now got our first cuff piece marked up. You're going to do exactly the same with the second one. What we're going to do now is mark a line along here to match these pieces up to. Because what's going to happen next is that you're going to sew this on upside down. You want the start of your cuff to be 2 inches from the edge of your hem. Now normally when you're hemming, you would leave your hemming allowance here and roll it back to be the final length that you want it. With this method, you don't leave extra seam allowance at the bottom here when you're cutting your sleeve piece. If you have, that's fine. You could just roll it under or trim it off, not a problem. If you want to make it so that you could actually take the cuff piece off, you could leave extra and just roll it into the seam allowance. But actually with this method, it's designed so that these sleeves won't easily come off. They are now an intrinsic part of the garment. So when you're cutting your sleeve length, you leave your normal seam allowance up at the top there, but you cut this at the length you want the finished sleeve. My apologies if the audio is a little bit strange on this video, but it's absolutely blowing a gale outside and you can hear it in every room of the house. There is nowhere to escape it, so I'm trying a new experiment to see if I can sort the audio out. So if you look here, we know that we've measured our 1/2 inch seam allowance here. So when we sew it on, it's going to be about there. So you need to measure 1.5 inches up, and that's where you're going to lay make your line to line up the edge of this. Now, earlier on I showed you it had gone a little bit wibbly, so you can also mark your 2 inches at the edge and line those up as well. But having this line all the way along just gives you a guide to work to get it nice and straight. Just very lightly mark that in. Now this is where again my trusty sewing mat is a joy to behold, because I don't actually need this line. I can line it all up using my guides at the sides. If you haven't got one of these and you're going, well, how do I get that line then? You just measure 1.5 inches at various points along and join it up with a line. Now this piece that we're working on is the outside of the sleeve piece. So make sure before you start you've decided which is your inside and your outside. Now, because we want this seam to be as neat and tidy as possible, a lot of the joining is going to be done on the inside. Now you saw earlier that that piece I was drawing out went a little bit off the line, which is why we're going to check very carefully before we pin and make sure everything is exactly where we want it. So you've laid your cuff piece right side down against the right side of your main fabric. And what we're going to do is just check that this line here is 2 inches all the way up. Now here it's not, it's gone wiggly woggly. So we're going to move it down a little bit. You can use that pencil line you've just drawn to go, right, okay, come on you, down a bit. Because you think it looks right at first, and then it's just gone a little bit off. So check all the way along, and when you're happy, you start pinning. I start in the middle, just because that helps keep everything in place so you don't end up going wibbly wobbly from one end to the other. If at any point you think, oh, I think that might have gone off a bit, just use your ruler to check. And I'm happy that is in the right place. Now you'll notice we haven't pinned all the way to the edge. What we're going to do, just so it doesn't wibble around, is pop a pin in here and here, because linen does like to wiggle. And even though we're not sewing that part, that will keep it lined up nicely for us. Now, these marks that we looked at, that we made earlier, just 1/4 inch in from our main sewing line for the edge of this, for the underneath of the sleeve here. That's where we're going to sew up to. We're going to leave this little last bit free. And when we come to sew it all together at the end, having that little bit left free and unstitched down means that we can line up the 2 points of the colour beautifully, because it's ever so easy to go off by a couple of mil each end, get to sewing up your sleeve at the end and go, I wish it was a little bit less uneven, that would really make me happy. So we're going to leave our little gap there, and then we can manipulate it at the end. What we're going to do now is prepare the other one, obviously, and then very, very carefully running stitch along this seam. I'll see you in a bit. You can see there I've just popped a few extra pins in the top to stabilise it as we take these ones out. You don't have to do that, I just like to overpin. Now we have both of our cuffs pinned and ready to sew. We're going to use a simple running stitch with the occasional reinforcing back stitch along this seam, because it's not going to take any great strain. I think you've seen me do that before, but if you haven't, I'll show you now. Okay, so we're ready to do our first bit of sewing. So remember we talked about earlier, this is going to be the point at which we stitch down the edge of the sleeve, but we're going to come in just a little way before we start stitching to give us room to manipulate that last little bit at the end and get it lovely and straight. I'm going to start off with a simple running stitch. Try and get your stitches as close as you possibly can. As I've mentioned before, most of the examples of Viking Age sewing that we see are really fine. You do get the odd one that's just ridiculous, very obviously done quickly and roughly, but most of the stitches are very small and it adds a great deal of strength. This seam isn't going to take any force, but we still don't want it going anywhere. So we're going to do a running stitch, adding in a little back stitch every now and then to stop it puckering up. And see, it wants to pucker. Just manipulate it with your fingers, get it laying nice and flat. We will press these at the end just to get any additional wiggles out, but if you can do it as you go, it will help improve your final result. Something that I often do as I'm doing this is just as I take each pin out, I pop it in just above to give me a little bit more stability. You can also, once you've done that bit, take your pin out, pop it underneath as well. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. Now you can see we're almost to the end here, so we're just going to stop our mark that we made about 1/2 inch away from the end. Pop in a back stitch, and another one. Just going to pop a little knot in the end. Lovely job. Do the other one, and then we're going to press it and fold it back. See you in a mo. And here we are, 2 cuff pieces ready to press and turn. Now you don't have to do this step if you don't have an iron or you don't want to iron it, fine, but pressing it here will actually give you a nice crispy edge, which makes my brain happy, so I do it. Very gentle little presses. Little circles work too once it's starting to lay where you want it. And then we're going to flip it. very gingerly because it's hot. Once you're happy, very gently encourage it into place with your iron. If you find you've gone a little bit wibbly wobbly, straighten it up. Number 1, same again. I'm going to do exactly the same for number 2. My apologies for the lighting in this shot, but that gale I mentioned earlier has turned into a very threatening sky as well. So everything's gone incredibly dark, and this lighting is currently with my main living room light, my ring light, and an additional light I nicked from my son just to try and brighten this up a bit, but honestly, I don't quite know what's going on. Now, once I've pressed it, what I do is flip it over, make sure I'm happy. As long as this main sleeve piece is just inside on either side, you're absolutely fine. Manipulate it until you're happy, and then just pop a couple of pins in to keep it from going too far, especially while it cools, because if you then dump it in a heap while the linen is still hot, you end up putting creases and wrinkles back in that you don't actually want there. Make sure you're not pinning it to your ironing board. So you now have both of your sleeve pieces prepped and ready to go. I'm going to go and get on with sewing the sleeves on, and when we get to about here of sewing down the sleeves, I'll come back and I'm going to show you how to finish these cuffs off beautifully. And here's some we made earlier. So you can see here the running stitch that I've used to close the edge of the sleeve. This is the one we're going to show you how to do today. This is the one that I've just completed. Now, something quite important. Don't know if you're like me, but when I sew seams that are going to be felled like this, I cut down the inside edge to make it flatter. You don't want to do that at the end here. You need to leave this open and just finish felling at the end, because both of these sides are going to be used when we flat fell this seam. Because there's quite a lot of bulk here, we're going to need to split it and curl it. I'll show you how to do that in the next step. So for this step, what we're going to do is finish closing this sleeve. Now the very important thing is getting it pinned in exactly the right place before you start. I've used these sewing clips just for this bit to make it easier to show you. If you open up here, what we want is these two pieces exactly together, or as absolutely close as you can get them. That's why we left that little bit at the end, so that if you find you open it up and you're a little bit off, you can just roll it under and get it to exactly where you want it. I've pinned that there for now. I'll show you on this one what that looks like at the end. When you come to do it, you'll have a beautiful equal seam meeting nicely in the middle there. You can see that's just that little bit we left loose, just there. You can always go back and tack that in if you want to, but it's not necessary. You can see here I've tied my thread in, my new piece of thread, on the inside here where it's going to be folded over. That's so that when you flip it on this side of the seam, you you don't see any nasty lumpy joins. If you've done it the other way around, you can just sew in the ends, but doing it that way gives you one less step to do. Now, exactly as we did before when we were attaching the cuff pieces, I'm just going to use a simple running stitch. I'm going to take the stitch with this thread, which matches as closely as we can to our body piece, to here, and then we're going to switch and we're going to finish off with the thread that matches our cuff pieces. Now, when you've got to here, what you're going to need to do is open this up again, pop a little pin in the bottom there, just so you've got your pieces nicely clamped together. So we're going to check that we haven't come out of alignment as we've gone along. That's looking pretty good. So you hold that carefully, and we're going to go just up to here with this thread and then tie off. Pop a back stitch in there. And tie it off. Now this one you don't have to worry about hiding because it's all going to be contained in there. Okay, now we've switched to the thread that matches our cuff piece. Now this first little stitch is quite important. Make sure you're coming inside so that you're going through the blue, the lighter blue rather. And what I do with this one is I try and keep it, my stitches a little bit more straight, because with a running stitch on a finer fabric you're sort of in and out and you get like a zigzag effect, but with this bit, because it's so thick, you can end up with your stitches very far apart. So what you want to do is just take it a little bit slower. Go straight in, flip it, straight in again. See, I've gone wobbly there. Come out, do it again. Every now and then, pop in a back stitch. Now we're coming on to this last little bit here. It's nowhere near as thick, it's half the thickness, so we can just do our normal running stitch with a couple of extra back stitches to finish this seam. Just at the end, bring your thread round and over the top to finish. Just make sure everything is exactly where you want it to be for the next stage. You can see there, it meets up perfectly using that technique. Lovely. We now have both of our sleeves sewn up the sides and we're ready to start felling. Okay, now we're ready to start pinning back these seams, ready to fell them flat. When you're sewing your sleeve pieces together, you need to make sure that you've got equal seam allowance on both sides at the bottom particularly. You can see further up here that I tend to trim away my seam allowance on the side that's going to be covered by the fell. So when you roll it over like that, it just makes the seams a little bit less bulky. But coming down to the end here, you need to make sure you've got both sides, especially for this last 3 inches or so. So to begin, we're going to split our seams, put our seam allowance down either side so that we can work with it nicely. Our first step is going to be dealing with this side. So that's a slightly less complex side to deal with. First of all, you're going to fold this sleeve piece seam allowance in half. Nicely like that. Give it a press with your fingers. Make sure all your little twiddly bits are tucked in. And then we're going to take this side. This one's come up a little bit short, so it's slightly fiddlier than the other one. I'm going to roll that and tuck it all underneath nice and neatly like that. And pop a pin in. Just lift it up to make sure you're not pinning the other side of the sleeve to it as well. Nothing worse than getting halfway done with all this pinning and realising you've actually pinned it to the other side of the sleeve and you've got to pull it all out again. Come all the way along, right to the bottom. So we're going to fell this all the way down. Happy. Now, the next stage you need to fold this one back. Get hold of this piece. Now this is where it gets a little bit different because with most felling, you just fold it under, job done. But because here, what we want to do is turn a split fell into a single fell. We're going to try something a little bit different. And we're going to roll it in thirds. Come up there, third, roll it all the way over. So now we've got a nice enclosed seam that we can gently push over to this side. Wiggle the linen about with your fingers as you go until you've got it exactly where you want it. Just makes this little cross piece at the end here. Again, before we go any further, I'm going to pop a pin in here. Make sure it's not stuck to the other side. Bring that tricky little thread down out the way. It's not going anywhere for a bit. So we're going to roll this in that direction all the way down. Then we're going to do the same as we did on the other side. Fold this down and under and pin. Slightly different here because this isn't going to try and tuck under that. This is just going to fold and lay on top of it. So pop that out of the way. Fold that down there. Okay, Now, to finish off this bit, as you can see here, I've already trimmed some of the seam allowance. I'm just going to come in and trim as much as I can off the rest there so that we can fold that back nicely. Very careful when you get to this bit. Make sure you're not taking any of that with you. Come inside, tuck it under, take it back a little bit further than you're going to pin with each pass, just so it keeps it all in line. And we're done. Now it looks really wibbly wobbly and strange at the moment, but I promise once you've taken your time sewing it all, which is what I'm going to show you next, it will look great. These bits I don't tend to pin, I tend to fold and press with my fingers as I go, but you can pin all the way up if you'd prefer to. Now we need to do the other one. And here we are, 2 pinned cuffs ready to fell. We're nearly there, folks. Yay! Okay, so now we've whip stitched up to here. I'm just going to show you how to do this little bit here and finish it off before we hem the cuffs. Now, a little trick I use, you can see here this thread I've used for the first lot of seams doesn't match very well. To get a nice matching thread for the whip stitching that's going to show on the outside of the garment, what I usually do is tease out some threads from a little scrap of the cloth that you used. You've got a perfect match then. Now you can see here I use this thread doubled up, and that is because it's very, very fine and you don't want your seams coming undone, and it will fray as well depending on the quality of the linen. You'll find you've got fluffy bits and things like that, so doubling it up is always a good idea. Now, with this one I've just used it exactly doubled, so I don't even have to tie a knot in it. Wibbly wobbly today, sorry about that. So, I'm going to remove our pin, and we're very, very carefully going to whip stitch this turned piece of felling down. Now, first of all, we're going to go along this main line down to the middle. You're going to need both sides of that little triangle it makes there down as well as the middle. On this bit, don't have to catch all the way through the fabric, you can just fell it to the other part of the turned seam. Here, we're going to turn our work. Just going to pull that out of the way a little bit. Pop my left hand in so I'm not felling to the other side of the seam. Do this last stitch at the bottom here. And come out over here. And we're going to start going up here. Using these little tiny whip stitches again, and just come up to where it meets the original running seam line there. And what we're going to do is we're going to come straight across, pop out here, make sure you're not showing on the right side of your fabric when you do this. Swivel around again, whip stitch down to the bottom. we get down to the end here, just going to tie a little knot, pop a couple in if you like. And then we're going to hide our thread tail inside here. Very carefully snip it off, and that's how you get a nice neat turn there. That's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to fray. Now we're going to go around here. For this part we're going to switch to our matching thread for our cuff piece. We're going to start at the bottom here, we're going to go all the way up and round. I always work from right to left when I'm sewing, when I'm felling seams. It's just what works best for my hands. If you're left-handed, you may find it easier to do it the other way around. Everybody finds their own way of doing these things, but this is the one that works for me. After trying it the other way and ending up finding that I couldn't get it very neat, I'll stick with this now. These are quite tricky, these little bits at the ends, but just experiment with how you're holding your fabric. Find what works best for you. Here we have our fully felled inner cuff. All that's left to do now is hem it. So now we're ready to fold back our hem, whip stitch round, and we're done. First of all, we're going to pin it into place. I actually use sewing clips for this bit because I find it somewhat easier, but you can use whatever you like. First of all, you're going to fold back till you meet your line here. Just leave a tiny little bit extra there. Don't need much, but you don't want any bulk when you turn. Any more bulk than you have to have. You're going to pin all the way around like this, just leaving little tiny gap there. It's not really even a gap, it's just make sure you don't overlap it, that's all. And once you've gone all the way around, you're going to fold in again. Once you're pinned all the way around and you're happy, you're ready to whip stitch. Now what I do is I start and finish my stitches in this bit, just because it's a little bit more forgiving for getting things tied off nicely. my thread end through, make a little knot, and off we go. You can see our stitching is almost invisible. Matching thread really helps. And there we have our finished cuff piece. Looks absolutely lovely on the inside. And when we turn it outside, voila! Look even better once it's had a press. So I'm going to go and get on with the other one, give them both an iron, and then I'll see you when all that's done. Bye! Here we have our finished cuffs. Lovely and neat on the outside, and as you can see here, nice and tidy inside as well, so they won't fray or catch as you wear the garment. Now there are a variety of ways that you can style these, so let's take a look. We've got similar plain cuffs here, but with a more richly dyed colour as the decoration. Now this is a great way to do it if your character is coming up in the world and can only afford a little bit of the more richly dyed cloth. On the inside of these cuffs, you can see what that little triangular seam looks like when it's felled to the other side. In this example, the person has chosen very different colours, and they've got a tiny little blanket stitch in linen thread for decoration and to reinforce the cuff seams. If you're really ready to show off your wealth, adding tablet braid next to or over your contrasting fabric really raises the status of the garment. While tablet braid was most often found near the edges of garments, we do have examples where the braid has been placed over seams and even silk trim, perhaps to reinforce a wearing edge or just to show off. You can also use this technique to add cuffs in the same fabric as the tunic, to add strength to the end of the sleeves, or as I've done here, to act as a base for decorative braids. Now if you fancy having a go at these 6-strand braids, amongst others, take a look at my cords and braids playlist. I'll pop a link to that up at the end. And that's all for today, folks. Thank you so much for being here. If you've got any questions, as always, pop them down in the comments or come and find me on Facebook. If you haven't seen my video on how to make these lovely necklines, I'll pop a little link up there for you. Now, I've got quite a bit more sewing to do to finish this beautiful dress, so I'm going to go and get on with that. You guys have a fabulous day, enjoy your sewing, and I'll see you soon. Bye!